Hello, I'm Maria Hall Brown, and this is LA Currents. Well, there is interest, there is investment, and then there is commitment. I am so delighted today to be joined by someone who has had a lifetime of commitment to explain issues that are tough to understand and help us all move forward. It is so wonderful to be joined today by writer, political analyst, Earl Ofari Hutchinson. So nice to have you here, sir.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
And when I say a lifetime commitment, it's truly been a lifetime commitment. You wrote your first book in 1970.
Wow, this is the 50th year, a half a century. And when you said 1970, at the risk of dating myself, but that's okay. The fact is, it has been a half a century. I was in my early 20s then, and that was my first book. And since then, there have been 27 others.
27 books, and obviously you're a prolific writer. You discuss very tough situations. You have a lot of advice. You've written for every scope of media there is. In terms of race and equality, have there been any, how are we progressing at all?
You know, Maria, I get that question a lot. And it's always, are we going forward, standing still, or going backwards? And I always start with this. The glass is half full and half empty. It's both. You know, obviously nothing stays the same. I mean, nothing stays the same in life, whether you're talking about individuals, whether you're talking about societies, whether you're talking about politics, whether you're talking about anything in society. There's always change. I mean, that's the essence of life, is change. So, I mean, obviously, as a country, we're not where we were, say, in 1950. We're not where we were in 1970 when I wrote my first book. I mean, we have progressed in a lot of different ways, politically, economically, socially, and of course, racially, race relations. I mean, obviously, we don't have legal segregation anymore. Obviously, we don't have, you know, the Jim Crow, this, that, and all those barriers then. And the good thing is we've seen so much progress in terms of economic uplift from so many that have been dispossessed over time, particularly African Americans, Hispanics, and other people of color. Obviously, when you're talking about women, I mean, so many changes we've seen there. And we've seen now, of course, new groupings, LGBT, binary. I mean, just so many new different mixes now. So I'm saying we're seeing a lot of interaction. And of course, young people, the kind of renaissance that we're seeing there, political and social awareness. I mean, that's the half full part. But then we got to be realistic. There is a half empty part, too. Certainly the last 3 or 4 years in this country, when we see the rise of white nationalism, white supremacy, alt-right, when we see the violence, we see the polarization that's there, when we see by every standard more poor people now, all the statistics and surveys have shown, you know, poverty has grown to such a point. We're in LA now. I mean, when you drive down some of the streets, they look like Calcutta.
Yeah.
I mean, so you have this side by side. You have much progress that's been made, but you have so much in many ways that actually has taken a step backward.
Okay, so there was a Los Angeles Times article, I think it was written about 5 years ago, that marked a distinction between the type of activist that you might be considered someone who would sit down at the table with political authority and work it out, versus the kind of disruptive activist that might be out there now that is just looking for disruption and wanting to break it down. How do you feel about both of those approaches? Which one do you think works, or does there have to be a combination of both, or should we just start from scratch?
I think you hit it when you said a combination of both. I mean, obviously you need people out on the point pushing. And we see young people. I mean, they don't have the patience. I mean, they have the energy, which certainly I don't. I mean, it's 50 years later. So, I mean, that's not going to be throttled there. I mean, they have to have their say, and they're going to have their say. Many ways, not listening to the older generation. I mean, look, you had your day. Now we're going forward. So we see that. You see a renaissance of social activism.
Yes.
Now, I'm a product of the 60s. And obviously, that was an era of deep social activism. So, I mean, a lot of me, when I see young people doing these things, I mean, my heart in many ways goes with them. I have to be sympathetic. Now, you know there's a but coming. The but part of it is this. I do step back and I think to myself, what's the end game? Okay, you go out, you make a lot of noise, you challenge authorities, the establishment, the power structure, whatever you want to call it, on a range of issues, whether it's poverty, police abuse, and all points in between. You do these things. And you're seen, you're visible, you create tensions, and the tensions have to be there. I mean, Dr. Martin Luther King understood that. But let's take him, and I'm circling back on the but part.
Okay.
Everything you're seeing a lot of the young people do today in the streets, I mean, we did that in the 60s. And certainly the civil rights movement of that time and Dr. King and those around him, they were always confrontational with the power structure. I mean, then it was to break down legal segregation. But their end game was changing public policy. How do you do that? After the protest, where do you go from here? Mm-hmm. Are you sitting down like King did with LBJ? Mm-hmm. He sat down with him and said, look, I'll be in the streets, but at the same time, I know we're trying to pass a Voting Rights Act. We're going to need Congress people, we're going to need senators, and we're definitely going to need the White House. We're going to need public opinion too. So what has to happen is there has to be, when you mentioned before, the combination, activism, vigorous, aggressive, hopefully peaceful, in the streets. On the other hand, you have to have a sense that we can sit down with the mayor, we can sit down with the governor, we can sit down with business leaders, we can sit down with all brands of elected officials and say, look, we have a series of objectives here. And we want to, after the protest, we're challenging you, make it happen. So the end game has always got to be, if you're serious about changing public policy and not just being a sound chamber, an echo chamber, you have to have a strategy, you have to have tactics, you have to be consistent, you have to be persistent, and you have to do something else. You have to be willing to sit down in a calm, reasoned, rational way and have something on the table. Have some objectives and spell it out. If you don't have that, basically you're just making noise.
Do you think that those voices are being heard now? Because with the most recent civil unrest, there does seem to be, coming from the political authority, words that imply that there is going to be policy change and that those voices have been heard.
Well, again, the operative word is the implication,
right.
But we don't know that. There's always a tendency in any society at any time to always slide back to what's normal, the old return to normalcy. After the protests, after you got thousands of people moving around, I've always felt that established leaders can just bide their time. Oh. Just sit there and do nothing. It's almost like let the big wind pass. And then what happens is a return to normal, unless you have groups of people that are willing to sit there without TV cameras, without microphones, without reporters, that glamour stuff, willing to do the hard, dirty, in the trenches work, behind the scenes work that takes time, it takes patience, it takes a strategy, it takes a plan, it takes objectives that are clearly spelled out, and a willingness to stick to it. If you're not willing to do that, then, to me, to be honest with you, it's just feel-good stuff.
You mentioned the media and the glamour of all of that, and just the whole landscape of the media has changed so dramatically in a very short period of time. There are sources that were never available, maybe even 15, 20 years ago, the 24-hour news cycle, et cetera. And you being someone who is so familiar with the media, having written for so many publications and so many broadcasts and having your own radio program on and on and on, what should people be listening for and what should people be ignoring when it comes to the truth and when it comes to something that is valuable for them to absorb?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question too, and that's always kind of like the old Diogenes thing, walking through with a lamp looking for an honest man or a woman. You know, that's a tough one to answer. The fact is, we're bombarded with so much now. I mean, from so many sources. You know, one of the things, it's kind of off to the side a little bit, but bear with me with this. In another world, also have another little passion, urban ballroom dancing.
Yes.
And we actually taught a couple of classes in that. So we cut a little 4-minute video last week, and it was a little party that we had, where we were just showing, I was showing some of the urban ballroom dance moves. Now here's the thing, when I do my big ticket political, social stuff, the writings, live streaming, social media, commentary, you know, it's like I get a yawn, maybe 5 people. This little 4-minute ballroom dance segment, I mean, thousands of people, I mean, tuned into it. I said, I can't believe this. I can't get 5 people, you know, when I write something serious. But this little frivolous, off to the side, fun and games, there's a point there. Back to your question, what happens is I think people are so bombarded with, quote unquote, the political, the social, that 24-hour news cycle that we see. I mean, how much can a person take of this? I need a relief. I need to have some fun. I need an escape. I need to get away from this. So trying to talk to people, trying to influence people, it's very difficult now because we have an overglut now. We really do. We have an overglut, and there's only so much in the human psyche that you can take at one time before you shut down. Oftentimes, you shut down to those compelling facts, those compelling truths, compelling things of action that people need to take to change their lives and to change society. So, because we've gone to the other extreme, to be brutally frank, we have too much. We have too much. And 30 or 40 years ago, it was minimalist then. You just had about, 3 major TV stations. You had newspapers in that people read in that era. And that was pretty much, and radio, and that was it. Now, look what you've got. You got a world of so many possibilities, so many interests, and frankly, so many distractions.
And bias,
And bias.
and myth and rumor, and presentation of things that are
It's a tough one.
so off the side that is not necessarily worth value. But you bring up an interesting point about the bombardment of everything, and I think most recently the caustic nature of everything that we are hearing. Does that worry you in terms of, can we be saved? Because it feels it's harsh. And the people that watched that lovely, refreshing ballroom segment that you did, but your point is so valid. It's harsh. Everything's, and are we, can we be saved? Can we actually see and read and make clear decisions, especially with an election coming up, when we're so frazzled with all of this?
If you, like so many people, want to be negative and go negative and say, you know what, oh, woe was me, doom and gloom, we're heading to destruction. We hear this stuff all the time. We're so polarized, nobody can ever reach across the lines. You hear this stuff continually. See, I'm not buying that.
Oh, good.
No, I'm not buying that. I think, I've lived long enough to see a lot of different changes. I've lived long enough to learn a few things. And one thing I've learned above everything else, sometimes you just need to stay the course as things are. And if you do that, you'll see changes. My father lived to be 101 years old. And one thing he always said, sometimes just stay alive. Just stick around. And what he was saying is you'll see the wheel turn around, the cycle turn around. We'll see things come back around again. And part of that coming back around again, I think, people sometimes, despite everything, all the obstacles that are there, we mentioned the media, we mentioned images, sounds, distractions, so many problems that many people face and challenges. There's a boundless, another side to human beings, the boundless capacity sometimes to understand what's best, not only in their interests as individuals and human beings, but in society's interests. In other words, to give back. Oftentimes, we see a disaster. Have you just noticed the outpouring when there's a natural disaster? Millions of people come forth. They may contribute $1 or $2. They may volunteer. They may do things. That tells me right there, there's a lot of good things in the human spirit that at the end of the day is not going to let us down. I think people will find the right path. if left alone. Problem is leaving them alone. But I have confidence and I have hope. I knew that the last 4 years would not last. Looking into the future, I don't have a crystal ball, I don't have anything. I don't have Ouija boards or tarot cards, I'm not a soothsayer. I just know, based on human nature being what it is, that there is a continuum of progress. And I think that there's going to change, and I think we're going to see positive changes, and I think conditions that will change people's lives as we go forward. I just had that confidence.
Well, you are a doctor of humanity. I mean, you have a doctorate in sociology, correct?
Correct.
So, you definitely not only look at the issues, but you look at the human spirit behind those issues. So when although you are not a psychic and a prognosticator, you do actually write about what you see is going to happen and why it's going to happen. So what is it that triggers that curiosity in you that spurs you to write about something?
Well, one, belief in the human spirit, the positive aspect of the human spirit. The other, there's an inherent curiosity about things. I'm an investigator. I always like to not only investigate, but also like to do something else too. I like to go beneath the surface. I like to try to plumb the depths as much as I can, not just look at what people are saying or what's happening right on the surface. Try to see, is there a cause and effect? Try to connect the dots. That's what I'd like to do. Oftentimes it gets me in trouble because, people are conditioned reflexively to see what's there. And I said, no, you got to go a little bit deeper than that. You got to go beyond that. If you really want to discern some real truths about life and about, human existence and about society. So I get into trouble because sometimes I put on the table painful truths. I'm not one to deny things. No, nor am I one just to go along with the crowd. Some people tell me, you're like the famous saying that a lot of firefighters have. When there's a major fire, when the crowds go out, we go in. I love that one. Well, I have to tell you, Maria, my life has been this. When the crowd goes this way, I tend to go the other way. Sometimes it gets me in trouble. But I'm not one that goes along with always the thinking as is. I have to see exactly what's behind that and where we're going with this, and then try to draw some conclusions from that. So, back to your point, that's what I'm looking at. Going into the depths, probing, analyzing, assessing, and then trying to connect the dots.
I'm surprised that you think you get in trouble. I think of you as an icon of activism and someone who has such really a very illustrious reputation for your thoughts and for your writing, etc. I can't fathom one of your subjects that got you in trouble. What gets you in trouble?
You ought to see how many people say on my Facebook page, I'm out of here. I don't like what you're saying.
Oh, well.
Well, it's all good. I mean, you have the right to agree, disagree, exit, or enter. That's your right. Well, I think a lot of times when you say things that challenge people, I'm not just talking about challenge people's beliefs, you're challenging their comfort zone. People tend to want to go along to get along. I'm comfortable with this, I'm comfortable in this kind of way in thinking. I've done things this way, I thought this way, and now you're coming along telling me something else. And it might be, I have to think about that. One thing that I have learned, when people have to think, and you challenge them, think. Come on, think, man. Think, woman. Think. Thinking can be painful.
True.
It can be painful.
True.
Now I've got to think about some of my assumptions about life and myself. I've got to think about some of the patterns of my behavior. I've got to think about some of the ways I'm used to doing things. I'm out of my comfort zone now. That is oftentimes when I make people uncomfortable. And when I do that, they don't like that. And of course, if they don't like that, they're not going to like me.
Well, but let's take that one step further. So you have been a strong voice in Black Lives Matter for a while. Well, but now there is probably a larger awareness for people who had not thought about it or had not realized their impact on it. So for people who want to be a little bit more sensitive, want to be a little bit more forward thinking, want to actually do something more positive, what mistakes should we avoid, and what things should we do to demonstrate that there is an amount of compassion and caring and awareness now that maybe we didn't have before? Where are we messing up, and what should we be doing better?
Well, I'd like to circle back on something I said a little bit earlier, and that is this. I think many, particularly young people, they're leading the way now, as often happens, and they're getting it. What we're seeing is recently in LA and many other cities, something, to be honest with you, Maria, I never thought in my life I would see. And I stopped one day over near USC because I had to stop because I couldn't get across the street for 15 minutes. And here's what I saw. What I saw, back to what I said before, I never thought I would see in my life. I saw almost no African Americans. Probably there were about 10,000 people. It took 30 minutes because traffic was stopped. They were marching. You mentioned Black Lives Matter. Now, I'm looking, I'm thinking, I'm watching as they're going by. I had no choice because, you couldn't get across. I don't see any African Americans. I see very few, some Hispanics and Asians. The overwhelming 95% were young whites. Now I'm saying, it is true during the 60s, you had many white, radicals, leftist students, but there was much narrower then. This was a broad cross-section of young people, I'm saying, cutting across all different lines, but also even more importantly, the income. I mean, we're talking about some probably sons and daughters granddaughters and grandsons of very well-to-do people. Now, they're all marching under these huge banners, Black Lives Matter. All of them had these T-shirts on, with the fist, Black Lives Matter. And I'm saying, now, if you had told me that a year ago, I'd said, you're nuts. I got a straitjacket to measure you for. It ain't going to happen.
Right.
But it did happen, and it is happening. So, right there, that tells me, back to what we were saying before, what isn't being missed is that young people are now feeling, many young people are feeling, look, life, a black life, or a person of color's life, has oftentimes meant very little. Has been diminished in so many ways, marginalized in so many ways. Now we're on your side. We're marching on your behalf. We're going to take some of the heat. We got it. That's a good thing when you see that. So that's not being missed there. I would say if there was anything, and by the way, many of their parents too, it challenged them. I got to think, boy, what kind of discussions did they have, behind closed doors? Right. But having said that, that was a good thing. Once again, I think the only little thing that kind of goes off in my head when I see this, what happens when COVID passes and you don't have time anymore? You're back in school. You follow me on this. You're back in school. You're back at work again. You're back with the partying again, with the social events. You're back in the fraternities and sororities. You're back in that life. Now, here's the real challenge. Will you be back out there again? Will you continue that again? Remember I mentioned before, consistency, follow through? Or is it just a feel-good, happy time, socializing, trendy kind of thing? I'd like to think it isn't.
Right.
But, and I'll leave it with the but.
Well, obviously, dramatic social change takes place after dramatic events, and I would imagine you witnessed when you were just a little teeny guy, you were only 6 years old, when you witnessed the Watts riots. That obviously had resonance with you. Do you still feel it? Do you still have that ghost of it with you? Does it still? And hopefully maybe what's happening now will resonate with these young people too.
Right. Well, I always say this, political activism is in my DNA.
Right.
Social activism is in my DNA. Activism is part of my DNA. No matter what age I am, I'm not going to tell you my age, but I'm not 19.
It's not hard to find out.
But the fact is, there's a few years here. So it's always going to be there because that's my heart. and that's my passion. So I always applaud that when I see that. Yeah, and on the 40th anniversary of the Watts riots, rebellion, uprising, whatever you want to call it, and the 50th, many of the news channels, they were all covering it at that time. They came in, we did a lot of interviews. I got sick to death of it after a while. They asked me to go back, because, I lived in the area, right in the middle of it. They asked me to go back and walk some of the streets and, and I did, and commented on it. But also said that, that was 40 and 50 years ago. And also the 1992 riots, too, that we had. I mean, that was 25, 27 years ago. So, all of these things, yes, they made an imprint. But I have to tell you this, I don't live in the past. No, I don't. I've been very careful about that, not to live in the past. I cherish many things from the past and try to use things as a learning experience from the past, but always with a view to what I'm going forward. So I always just say, like many of our religious people say, God didn't put eyes in the back of your head. He put eyes in the front of your head for a reason. We're always going forward and looking forward. There's a little tendency for nostalgia. Think about the past, and a lot of times it's people, whoa, I remember how it used to be. Well, no. Yeah, I do remember how it used to be, and a lot of that I don't want to remember. So no, we're going forward all the time. We did have Cal State University Dominguez. They had a big 50th anniversary because they opened up the archives at Cal State Dominguez. They asked me to keynote it. They had about 2,000 people that came out for, actually it was a dinner, and they had a lot of speakers, and it was a huge event. And one thing, when I closed it out, I said, yes, I lived through a lot of that, and I'm still living now. I mean, I'm still vertical. But at the same time, be careful. Learn many of the lessons that came out of that. Only for this reason, you don't want to repeat them. You don't want to repeat that again. Everything has a cautionary note from the past.
And it lit a spark, but obviously, it's a fire that's continued with you for, your life. You're not all that serious about every corner of your life. You did mention the ballroom dancing, which I think is spectacular. And so what is it about the ballroom dancing that became a part of your, your vernacular as who you are?
And it's an interesting story. I think about that all the time. It was about 6, 7 years ago when I got involved. Here was a blend, how sometimes you never know on road's life, the little twists and turns and what's around the next bend. People need to be careful about assuming things about the future. You don't know.
Right.
So I happened to be talking with the director of one of our community centers. I was going to do a political issues class. Well, not really a class there, it was in the community. It was going to be like a round table. We were going to talk weekly about social and political issues, and I was going to be the facilitator. I had pitched him about that. So it happened to be on a Monday. He was in his office. I made an appointment to go down to see him. I go down, and out of the corner of my eye when I walk in, I'm here to talk about political, social things. What do I know about dancing? What do I know about anything? So they're having a class, a ballroom dance class. And I'm fascinated. And then a couple of people I knew and it came over, that knew me. I said, what is this? And they told me. I said, oh, interesting. Something went off here. So at first I had a war with myself. No. You know how we have those wars.
Sure.
But I don't know, there was something there. I said, let me go back and take a look. I walked in, I knew I wasn't going to like it. I knew I just wanted to satisfy my curiosity. And guess what?
You love it.
I loved it. 6 years later.
I am really honored to have had this time with you. You are a poet and a gentleman, and you have made enormous change in the world. And I certainly hope that people hear, read, and listen to what you say, because it's an incredibly important thing. So.
Well, I want to thank you for having me in Channel 35. I appreciated that.
Absolutely. Well, you be well, and we'll talk again soon.
You know we will.
All right. And keep on dancing.
Keep
and
on
that's
dancing.
a wrap on this LA Currents.